Building chords is hard enough itself. You don't need chord charts to make it harder. Let's discuss that. Okay, so what am I talking about here? Well, first of all, welcome back to Guitar Evolutions. My name is Steve Dempster, and the purpose of this site, as always, is to help students, guitar students, make connections between things and make their learning of the concepts of those things easier to digest. And sometimes along that pathway, I think people are adopting ways of learning that are essentially counterproductive, even though they may be very popular out in the real world. So I want to talk about this a little bit. And I thought using the context of chord charts would be a good start. So what is it he's talking about? Well, take a look at this one. So that's a pretty typical chord chart that you will see all over the place. In this case, it's a G major chord. I happen to like the version of the chord where I get to use my pinky and my third finger. So it might look a little different than maybe what some of you use when you make G, but don't worry about that. The concepts that I'm going to talk about, the procedures, are still all the same. So that would be pretty typical that a teacher would present that chart to someone and perhaps show them how to read the chart and then demonstrate how to place the fingers on the chart, or sorry, on your fretboard, and away you go. And there you have it. You have a visual of what this thing called G major is all about. And by and large, you would be sent on your way home and be told to practice that. And then we'll talk more about it next week when I see you again. Here's a second chart. This one has a little bit more information in it by including the fingerings. And of course, that's going to help. That means that when you get home with the chart, you can continually work the placement of the fingers and continue to build the G major chord, believing that you're practicing it. And I'm going to come back to that statement in a bit, because probably what you're doing is sabotaging your ability to build the chord effectively, to be a guitar player. Here's the next one. This is the kind of chord chart that I'm more interested in, because the previous two are just giving you a shape. They're telling you information about, graphical information about the location of fingers on strings inside of frets on a fretboard. With this particular chart, you would have the tendency to go home and your practice time would include putting your fingers onto the strings in the order that they are numbered. Pretty common. And then with some assumption that by repeating this over and over and over, you're somehow going to be able to pull the chord off in a decent amount of time. Doesn't tend to work. Just like the previous diagram with just the dots, if you're just figuring out what fingers you might use and playing the chord and reading the dots, it's probably not going to work in the long term either. This one, however, is what I prefer to use with my students most of the time. Depends on where people are at in their understanding of the chord, but I like this the best. The location of certain notes that basically make up the chord. The fingerings I can often write at the bottom of the chart, and they will vary from person to person depending on their comfort level, depending on their anatomy, depending on any injuries they may have or any chronic like arthritic conditions and things like that. All of this has to be taken into account when you're helping somebody learn to play the guitar. It's dangerous for us teachers to assume just because we have perhaps healthy hands that can make all these things, that the way we do it is the way we kind of expect you to do it. That's not a good plan. So, you know, you've got these three versions of chord charts. Any one teacher can use whatever approach they prefer. Typically, I don't see the usage of chord charts with the notes that make up the chord in the chord chart. It's as if that's extraneous information, but it isn't, and I'm going to talk about why that is now. In the first two charts, you're getting the impression right away when it's presented to you. This is so important because it sticks with students a long time. You're getting the impression that a chord is a shape, and of course it is. But it isn't just a shape. In the first chord diagram, you would be forgiven for thinking that that's the look of a G chord, such that every time a G is required somewhere, that's the shape you're going to make. And in the second diagram, pretty much the same thing. You're just getting more information about how it is more typically fingered, and then you put your fingers in place. Typically, again, your practice in this one would look like this is where you put your first finger, this is where you put your third, this is where your second, this is where you put your third, and that's your practice. Those two pictures, to me, very easily communicate to a student who has never really thought about this, that the way you learn to build a chord is to basically build it in the order that the fingers are required. If the teacher does say the goal is to put all fingers down at once, and I think most students intuitively know that, why is it that for months, and in some cases even years, if I'm watching somebody make a G chord or any other one, if you look carefully, they're still putting fingers down one after the other? Well, the answer is obvious. That's how they taught it to themselves. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's how the teacher left that discussion. And the student just continually builds the chord one finger at a time. I call it onefingeritis. And then they complain, the student, after a few months of trying this, that they still can't get from one chord to the other because they're so busy still trying to build the first chord that they can't get to the second chord on time. So clearly something's missing in the way students perceive these chord structures and how they're built. The third example that I have is, to me, a more complete statement of how chords are meant to be learned. Not so much from the point of view of memorizing the notes, although that's a good strategy. But that image does not give you any impression that you have to put any one particular note in place first, and then another one second, and then another one third, as is communicated typically by chord charts that tell you what fingers to use. Because students innately interpret, this is where you put your first finger, they'll put their first finger down, and then their second, then their third. Now, again, not a problem. Any one of those chart graphs could be useful to a student. The challenge is what happens after the initial introduction of the chart to the student. Did the teacher say, we will not be finished learning how to build chords until you can bring all the fingers down at once? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Our goal is to do that. So the student, without that extra bit of information, continues to do the one finger at a time thing. And it kind of makes sense. Once you get one finger in place, it allows you to place another finger in relation to the first finger, and then another finger in relation to the second finger. It makes sense, but it's kind of dangerous because you are relying on a particular finger and string combination. You're using that as a crutch to go and locate where the next finger should be. Again, do that for a short period of time, but there's a far better strategy for the long term. So those, the first two charts tend to give students this impression that because when they learned the chord, they did it one finger at a time, when they go home to practice it, that's what they're practicing. They practice one finger at a time. So they come back week after week after week, still trying to play a particular tune that they want to do, and they're struggling with getting the chord built. Now compare this scenario to the piano player. When they learn a chord, of course, they are learning by the nature of the instrument. They're learning the notes that they're looking for on the keyboard that make up that chord. They visualize them, and then through some training, they know what fingers make the best sense to grab those notes, and then they bring their hand to the keyboard, arrange the fingers accordingly above the notes that they need, and then they drop it down to make the chord. Probably only for the briefest of time would they have ever, okay, I got to put this finger here first, and then that one and that one. But when they look at the music, they'll see that all the notes they need are all stacked up on top of each other, just like this image here. And that image completely tells you that you don't put one finger down at a time. The whole cluster of all of that stuff has to happen at once. And it's that lack of training that prevents students from being able to make good, clean chord changes on time for the song that they really want to play, the song that they love. It's very frustrating. Compare that to the chord chart that I prefer, which has the notes written out. Again, I'm not suggesting it's there for the memorizing of the notes, but what it doesn't do is it gives you no impression when you look at it that you should put this finger down first or that finger down second. At some level, it's actually communicating that all of them need to be in place at the same time. And the challenge for starting players, and typically they come to the guitar with chording in mind. The challenge for them is to train their hand to be able to make those shapes that they see in their hand so that they can grab the chord all in one chunk. Now, I can hear you through the cameras yelling at me saying, hey Steve, if we just keep going one finger at a time and we keep repeating it, we are going to get better and better at putting the fingers down all at once. I don't disagree. I will say, however, it's probably not going to happen as quickly as if you took a more active approach to how you could train your hand to put the fingers down all at the same time. Instead of just sort of letting it happen unto itself. You know, it's everyone's different with regards to how well they'll coordinate that. But it is, for a guitar player, the building of chords represents one of the biggest significant bumps that they have to get over in order to play anything. The second bump is going to be the changing of chords on time. And this is where, if the first problem isn't solved, I guess I should do it from this angle. If the first problem, that is the building of a chord, isn't under control, then the changing from one chord to the next is going to compound the original problem by interfering with the timing nature of when that second chord needs to come in. And yet, again, piano players don't tend to suffer this. Their practice is about adjusting the hand, I'll just use one hand, adjusting the hand to the requirement of the chord. Yes, they can see it better. I get that. We guitarists have to look down at this sort of an obtuse angle. It's hard to see things, and sometimes you can't. It has to become a bit more of a feel. It's an added complexity for sure, for which the student tends to push the guitar out a bit more so they can see the fretboard, but they're straining their wrist more. So if you think you're being clever by pushing the guitar out, you're actually doing damage to the thing that you're trying to work. So don't go that route, but I understand that. Whereas the keyboard players, they comfortably can see everything. But that's not really an excuse for us to complain. We still have to train our hands to do what's required. And if what's required is that the full chord needs to be built because we're strumming along, or trying to the song we want to play, then you have to have that skill in place. So those two images tend to communicate a sequence. Some kind of a sequence is going on. Do this, do this, do this. Practice that. The third image, which is the one I like, I've said this many times already, doesn't tend to communicate that at all. It really communicates that all of the stuff that they see in the image has to be in place at once. Well, how do you practice that? How do you make sure that the building of the chord is being done efficiently? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about in our next video. This is a series of at least 3, possibly 4 videos on helping students with the mechanics of building chords and changing chords. Because until, let's face it, until that is accomplished, it's very difficult, very frustrating to enable anybody to play a particular tune, unless it's the simplest of simple tunes. And that's not usually the case for most people. They like what they like, and we teachers attempt to get them to play some form of it. But step one will always be, you've got to get these chords built and then ultimately changed. Anyway, I hope that helps. Steve Dempster from Guitar Evolutions. See you in the next video. Bye.